So we'd been underground for 4 hours. We paddled through the mouth of the cave in a boat, we'd ducked under stalactites and climbed up stony cliffs, and now we were staring into the tightest passage you can imagine, barely a foot high. My guide, Robert, got down on his belly and squirmed through. We were in a cave on his property in France, and he was excited to show me something. I got down on my belly after him, but as I went horizontal, I knocked my headlamp against the roof of the passage, and everything went dark. We know almost nothing about what lies beneath our feet. Up here on the surface, we know everything, every inch. With Google Maps, we can swoop down on distant rainforests and deserts, but the underground is more of a mystery. It's like a whole forgotten continent lying just beneath our feet. Under us right now are thousands of miles of tunnels that we know nothing about. There are secret bunkers and ancient cities that haven't been excavated. There are beautiful caves where no human has stepped foot in thousands of years. Scientists who study the underground call these spaces beyond the reach of light the dark zone. I'm a journalist and an explorer, and I've spent the last 10 years traveling all over the world investigating our planet's hidden and forgotten subterranean spaces. I've strapped on boots and coveralls and gotten muddy, but I've also studied how we think about these spaces, how we talk and dream about them. And what I've seen is that the underground plays an enormous part in the human story. It's helped guide how we think about ourselves and given shape to the deepest parts of our imagination. Now, for me, all of this started when I was 16 years old. I discovered an abandoned train tunnel that ran directly beneath my house in Providence, Rhode Island. It was a big, spooky space. It had been abandoned for 25 years, and it had stalactites coming down from the ceiling and mud on the floor. The first time I headed through the entrance, I was terrified. But something about it got under my skin, and I kept going back. It was the magic of discovering the most mysterious, alien, otherworldly space directly beneath the place I was most familiar with. A few years later, I was living in New York City and encountered an entire community of tunnel enthusiasts, urban explorers they were called. With them, I started poking around in sewers and wading down subterranean rivers and running subway tracks at night. Going underground in New York was like learning all the city's secrets. We would find graffiti that no one else knew existed. We would come across abandoned subway stations that the explorers referred to as ghost stations. We even encountered people who lived underground, the so-called mole people who had made lives for themselves in the tunnels. At a certain point, I was just completely obsessed. I would spend entire afternoons riding the subway with my forehead pressed against the glass, looking out into the dark for signs of ghost stations. I could barely walk a block in New York City without stopping to peer down into a sewer grate. And at a certain point, I started to wonder why. What was this all about? Why was I so attracted to these spaces? And so I left New York. I began traveling to different parts of the world to explore underground. The thing about the underground is that we don't belong there. Humans are evolved for life on the African savanna. We like lots of sunlight and abundant oxygen and open horizons. Underground, we're aliens. We're afraid of the dark. We're claustrophobic. The underground is the land of the dead. It's the upside down. We should do everything in our power to avoid the underground. It's the exact opposite of every environment that makes us comfortable. But as I traveled, I began meeting other people like myself who had developed a deep connection to subterranean space. In Paris, I spent time with the cataphiles, the lovers of the catacombs, who would spend days and nights roaming the limestone tunnels under the city. They would go down there to host concerts and secret gatherings and to make art. In South Dakota, I met members of the Lakota tribe who believed that their ancestors originated underground. They would visit the mouth of Wind Cave, where the very first humans emerged on the Earth's surface. In Cappadocia, in Turkey, I spent time investigating an ancient culture of people who lived underground, who had carved their homes into the sides of stone cliffs in order to protect themselves from invaders. On a trip to Western Australia, I spent time with an Aboriginal family who for generations had been going into the depths of a mine in order to extract red ochre from the earth, which they then used to make paintings. In Mexico and Belize, I spent time with Maya people who for generations had been telling stories about caves and sinkholes known as cenotes. I went deeper and deeper into history, and I began speaking to archaeologists and anthropologists who study caves. And what I learned is that for the entire history of our species, our ancestors believed that caves were sacred spaces. They believed that to cross the threshold of a cave was to leave the familiar earthly world and enter an underworld, a spirit world, where you could convene with ancestral deities. And we find this everywhere. In the Old Testament, Elijah first speaks to God in a cave. Muhammad first communicates with Allah in a cave in Saudi Arabia. Native American shamans always conducted rituals in caves. Ancient Greek oracles always lived in caves. And today, when archaeologists go into caves, they find evidence of these religious rites. They find burials and sacred paintings and precious stones that were given as offerings. One archaeologist told me about a site in northern Spain called Cima de los Huesos, which means the pit of bones. And there, deep in a cave, deep in the dark zone, they discovered 22 skeletons that dated back as far as 600,000 years, which is way before Homo sapiens even existed. And among the bones, they found a beautiful stone tool made of red quartzite, which they've come to call Excalibur. And that site, they believe that Excalibur was left with those skeletons intentionally as a way of honoring the dead and acknowledging their journey into the spirit world. That site is now believed to be the very first evidence of religious behavior anywhere in the world. Now, all these years later, I think we still have a connection to the underground, to the dark zone. Not that we're going down to perform ceremonies or conduct rituals, but I think when we peer into the mouth of a cave or a dark tunnel or even into a dark basement, something in our core is activated. We're unnerved by the darkness, but beneath that, fascinated by it and attracted to it. And I think that like our ancestors, we acknowledge the power of interacting with an environment that is so utterly separate from the spaces we're familiar with. I think we need the dark to make sense of the light. We need the upside down. And this attraction to darkness is part of us making sense of ourselves, reaching out to connect with something larger than who we are. Now, back to that cave in France. I got my headlamp working, got to my feet, wriggled out of that passage. Robert was waiting from the other side, and he pointed to the cave floor. There was a footprint. It had been left there 14,000 years ago. We climbed deeper and deeper into the cave until we got to the very last chamber, as deep into the dark zone as we could possibly get, a mile from the entrance. And there, in that chamber, illuminated in the glow of our headlamps, were two sculptures. clay sculptures of bison, a bull in front, a cow behind, each about 2 feet long. They were beautiful. You could see where the people who made the sculptures dug the clay out of the cave floor. You could see in the body of the sculptures where their fingernails had left marks. And surrounding the bison was an array of hundreds of footprints. Mysteriously, all of them heel prints, which archaeologists believe are the remnants of a ritual dance performed there 14,000 years ago. Now, all these years later, we know almost nothing about the people who made those sculptures. We know nothing about what the bison represented to them. But standing in that chamber, the power of those sculptures felt so familiar. It felt like time was falling away. And standing next to Robert, I have found that I had tears coming down my cheeks. Never have I felt so human as I did in the depths of that cave, staring down at those bison. Now, I'm not here to try to get you all to spend your lives crawling around in the dark. But I want you to remember that these spaces are there. And when you think of the underground, I want you to remember that the world is always larger and deeper and stranger and more mysterious than we recognize. Thank you.